start by saying thank you, Bob Heck, for agreeing to this debate. I believe that discussion of these ideas and discussion of science and of what the scientific community knows about the history of life on Earth is one of the most important questions that is facing us today. It is true that acceptance of the evolutionary theory is, to put it bluntly, pretty terrible in the United States. And I would like to begin first by giving a brief discussion of the history of evolutionary theory from its formulation to its subsequent refinements and the subsequent ideas and discoveries that have come forth to put this together into a coherent picture. So, evolution was first formulated by Charles Darwin in his immensely well-cited work, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And evolutionary theory, as Darwin laid it out, had three very basic and very simple precepts. The first principle is that more life is produced than successfully survive to reproduce and propagate the next generation. This is trivially true in every species every species in nature that you look at. The second principle is that there exists variations within every population, and that these variations can influence an individual's chance of successful reproduction. This too, trivially easy to see and demonstrate and describe. And three, the most important one, is that this variance in survivability and in ability to reproduce in an environment is inheritable, that it's transmissible through genetics, and that variants which grant an advantage to an individual or to a population tend to increase in number and gradually overtake the characteristics of the entire population. So this was proposed in 1859, and what immediately followed was decades and decades of furious debate among scientists, among geologists, among anatomists, among all of the people characterizing fossils that are being dug up in Africa and in various other parts of the world, geologists looking at sections of the Earth and looking at the layers of fossils found therein, and taxonomists looking at various different species of animals and organisms and noticing that they all fall into very, very neatly nested clay, very neat split hierarchies of similarity to each other that seem to point to descent from a common ancestor. By the 1900s, within the scientific community at least, it was very difficult to be a self-respecting biologist without accepting that there is significant evidence for the idea that life arises and that species arise through a process of natural selection, and all of them share common descent. So, I've mentioned fossils before, and Bob has mentioned fossils as well, but I'd like to pause on that for a moment and talk about the one thing that Darwin didn't have. The thing that Darwin didn't have was a mechanism for this generation of variants. He proposed the mechanism in Origin of Species, which, when you read it now, is laughably out of date. But what we do have now, thanks to the advent of genetics, starting from Mendel at the turn of the century, on to work in fruit flies, looking at segregation of DNA, to finally, in the 1950s, Watson and Crick discovering the structure of DNA. All of the stuff from then on, and then in the early 1980s, 1990s, 2000s to today, with the advent of genome sequencing and the reading of the DNA code of many thousands and tens of thousands of different species, different types of animals, different types of creatures in the world, we now have genetic evidence of a degree that it is not possible to state that common descent is not true. What we see in the DNA is exactly the pattern that we see in species when we look at them by anatomy, when we look at them by distribution, when we look at the fossil record, when we look at their history. The same relationships that we can draw by looking at the physical characteristics of it exactly when we look at the pattern of changes, the pattern of variation, and the pattern of mutations in their DNA. For example, what we can see, for example, is supposing we have three species, let's say chimps, humans, and gorillas. What we see is that chimps and humans share a whole set of mutations that are not shared by gorillas, and that chimps, humans, and gorillas share a set of mutations which are not shared by lemurs. Chimps, humans, gorillas, and lemurs share a set of mutations that are not shared by squirrels. All of the primates and squirrels have similarities in their DNA that aren't shared by frogs. Frogs, squirrels, humans, the primates have similarities in their DNA that aren't shared by jellyfish. And then the more you look at the DNA, the more you see that there are patterns of similarity within things that we would call phyla, within groups of organisms, as we like to think of them from a traditional classification standpoint. And that there are differences that we see between individual species, between individual groups, and that these differences nest perfectly, no matter what gene you look at, no matter what sets of genes you look at, no matter what characteristics in the DNA you look at, you always find the same pattern of relationship. Theodosis Dobzhansky in 1973 said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And I would like to really hammer home how true that is. Evolutionary theory, common descent, really is it's the underlying principle behind everything that we do in biology. It influences our decisions in medicine. It influences what we know about disease, what we know about disease-causing organisms, disease-causing conditions. It allows us to use our evolutionary history to find answers to common medical problems that plague us. How much time do I have?
2 minutes, 30 seconds.
2 minutes, 30 seconds. So it influences us in medicine. It influences us in looking at species, and everything that we find in biology, starting from an assumption of common descent, starting from an assumption of evolution, is really the only way that you can come to new discoveries, is the only way that you can discover anything novel about whatever system you're studying. To be a biologist that doesn't believe in evolutionary theory is like being a doctor that doesn't believe in the germ theory of disease. Is like being a physicist that doesn't believe in the law of universal gravitation. Really, it's so fundamental, and it's so well supported by so many lines of evidence, by every line of evidence that science has ever come up with, that to not hold it as something that we should believe in, to think of it as flawed in any sense, is silly. There are a lot of details that may be open to debate. For example, the details of speciation of individual species, the evolutionary origin of any particular structure. But the pattern that we